Part 1. The shell weighed nearly as much as a full-grown man. 2,700 pounds of steel and explosive, wider across than most people's shoulders, nearly 5 feet from base to tip. Sat in the magazine below the waterline, in the dark, in the cool, in the silence where metal ships keep their most serious intentions. Above it, 9 more just like it waited in their racks. Above those, 3 gun barrels extended outward into the salt air, each one more than 60 feet long, each one machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This was the main battery of USS New Jersey, the most decorated battleship in the history of the United States Navy. 19 battle stars, 4 wars, 50 years of service. In all that time, not once did those gun barrels point at an enemy warship and fire. Not once. Before you can understand why, you have to understand what that ship was built to do. And to understand that, you have to go back to the fear that built her. In 1939, intelligence reports began reaching Washington about something the Imperial Japanese Navy was building in the yards at Kure. Something large, something unprecedented. The reports were fragmentary, uncertain, deliberately obscured by the Japanese security services, but the outlines were clear enough to cause alarm. A battleship. 2 of them, actually. Each one larger than anything any navy had ever constructed. Yamato and her sister Musashi. 65,000 tons of steel and concrete when loaded. 9 guns of 18-inch caliber that could throw a shell more than 25 miles. Armor belt 2 feet thick, impervious to the largest guns then in service in the United States fleet. The American response was the Iowa class. 4 ships, authorized by Congress in 1939, and laid down in the early months of the war. Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin. Each one built around a single strategic purpose: to find the Yamato and the Musashi, to engage them in surface combat at distance, and to destroy them. The naval architects designed the hull around the gun, the hull around the machinery around the purpose. And the purpose was simple: kill Japanese super battleships. USS New Jersey was laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in September 1940. Her keel went into the dry dock as the Battle of Britain was still being decided in English skies, as Wehrmacht columns were still spreading across Europe, as the United States had not yet declared war on anyone. She was built by thousands of workers, many of them women who had entered the shipyards when the men left for other kinds of service, their hands shaping the steel that would become the ship that would, according to plan, end Japan's dominance of capital ship warfare. She was launched in December 1942. She was commissioned in May 1943. By the time she entered the Pacific Ocean for the first time, the war had already changed into something her designers had not fully anticipated. To understand what had changed, you have to think about what a battleship was built to do and why, for the first time in military history, that thing was no longer the thing that decided wars. For 200 years, since the era of sailing ships and line-of-battle tactics, naval power had been measured in what one ship's guns could do to another ship. Ship with the bigger guns at longer range, more shells per minute, better fire control won. The ship that couldn't penetrate the other ship's armor at useful ranges lost. This was the fundamental grammar of naval warfare, and it had held since before the United States existed as a country. Midway changed the grammar. 4 months before New Jersey was even commissioned, 6 months before she was anywhere near the Pacific, American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown had changed the fundamental equation of naval warfare in a single afternoon. June 4th, 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, burning on the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sunk by aircraft, not by surface guns. Sunk by bombs dropped from the sky, not by shells fired across the water. The battleship had ruled naval warfare for 2 centuries. Aircraft carriers had ended that rule in one day. The Navy knew what Midway meant, even if no public announcement made it explicit. The admirals understood. The strategic planners understood. The ship that decided naval combat was no longer the one with the biggest guns beneath the waterline. It was the one that could put the most aircraft over the enemy fleet. And yet, New Jersey was commissioned. And yet, Iowa was commissioned. And yet, Missouri and Wisconsin were commissioned because the hulls were already in the yards and the steel was already cut, and stopping would have cost more than finishing. Because a battleship that couldn't sink enemy battleships could still do other things. Could provide anti-aircraft fire, could deliver shore bombardment against land targets, could escort the carriers, keep submarines and smaller enemy surface ships away, act as the muscle that protected the aircraft carriers that were now the real weapons. So the most powerful battleships ever built by the United States Navy went to the Pacific as bodyguards. This is where the story of USS New Jersey should have ended its first act, in the quiet dignity of a purpose unfulfilled but not disgraceful. A ship built for one thing, used for another, not unheroically. Many ships serve in roles they were not designed for. That's war. But in November of 1943, something happened that no one planned and no one could explain without embarrassment. And it said something about the particular kind of absurdity that follows powerful machines when powerful men are around them. President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed to get to Tehran. First wartime summit between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin was scheduled for late November 1943. Roosevelt was 61 years old, confined to a wheelchair by the polio that had changed his life 2 decades earlier, and the only way to get him safely to Tehran was by ship and then by aircraft. The Navy assigned him the most powerful and fastest ship in its fleet, USS Iowa. The presidential party aborted on November 12th. Roosevelt brought his senior military advisors, his physician, his personal staff, and the particular weight of command that traveled with a wartime president wherever he went. Iowa departed from Hampton Roads, Virginia, heading east across the North Atlantic with a destroyer escort flanking her on both sides. The destroyers were there to protect Iowa from submarines. One of those destroyers was USS William D. Porter. William D. Porter was what the Navy called a Gleaves-class destroyer, named for Admiral William D. Porter of the Union Navy, a competent ship of its type. Her crew was experienced. Her officers were professional. She had been in service since 1943 and had acquitted herself adequately in the months since commissioning. On November 14th, during a training exercise, William D. Porter conducted a simulated torpedo attack against Iowa as part of standard drills. In a simulated torpedo attack, the crew goes through all the motions except one. They arm the tubes, they track the target, they run the fire control solution, they give the order to fire. But they don't actually fire, except one of the torpedoes in William D. Porter's tubes had not been properly safed. The drill proceeded normally until the moment of simulated fire. Someone on the crew, in the confusion of the exercise, removed the safety from one tube. When the order came down the chain of command, one torpedo left the ship. A real torpedo, armed, running hot. Iowa had approximately 10 seconds. The crew on Iowa's bridge, watching the exercise from a position of complete theoretical safety aboard the most powerful battleship in the world, saw the torpedo's wake in the water. The captain ordered a hard turn. Iowa swung to starboard. Torpedo struck the wake created by the turn, detonated in the churned white water, and caused no damage to the ship. Aboard William D. Porter, the commanding officer immediately sent a message to Iowa. It read, "We have just fired a torpedo at you." In the immediate aftermath, the Secret Service drew their weapons and began scanning the ocean for submarines they believed were attacking. It was only when the full picture emerged, when the communication between ships had been untangled, that the reality became clear. The most powerful battleship in the world, carrying the President of the United States and the military advisors who were planning the entire Allied war effort, had nearly been sunk by one of its own escort vessels in a training accident. Iowa survived. Roosevelt was uninjured. He reportedly watched the torpedoes run through binoculars with a calm that either reflected presidential composure or a man who had survived so much that one more brush with death had lost its novelty. William D. Porter's commanding officer was placed under arrest, pending investigation. Every member of the ship's crew was confined to the vessel. The incident was classified at the highest level. No newspaper reported it. Public did not learn what had happened for years. The torpedo had missed. But what followed Iowa into the Pacific, what accompanied her into every engagement and every missed engagement and every battle fought by carriers while she stood watch, was a particular irony that the torpedo incident had made visible. The most powerful ship in the world, built to destroy the most powerful enemy ships in the world, had demonstrated in its very first significant operational moment that it could be nearly destroyed by one of its own people making a mistake in a drill. War is not usually the clean meeting of designed purposes. War is usually the collision of what things were meant to do and what circumstances actually require. Battleship had been built for one war. It had arrived in another. Part 2, the largest naval battle in the history of human warfare, was fought in late October 1944 in the waters of the Philippine Islands. The scale of what happened there has no true parallel. 4 major engagements over 4 days. Hundreds of ships of every class. Aircraft launched in numbers that made the sky dark. Submarine attacks, torpedo attacks, airstrikes, surface engagements, night battles with searchlights and radar and guns firing in darkness. Japan committed nearly every major warship it had left. The United States committed the greatest concentration of naval power any nation had ever assembled. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey were there. Neither of them fired a single shot at an enemy surface warship. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the geography of the battle and the decision that one man made on the morning of October 25th, 1944. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, known throughout the fleet as Bull, had commanded fighting men since before most of his sailors were born. He was 61 years old, aggressive by instinct and by reputation, the most famous combat admiral in the American Pacific War. His ship at that moment was New Jersey. He commanded 3rd Fleet from her bridge, which meant that the most powerful warship in the world was also his flagship. When Halsey wanted to move, New Jersey moved. Japanese high command understood something that many historians have only fully appreciated in retrospect. They understood that they had lost the war. They understood this in the summer of 1944, when the Philippine Sea Battle destroyed the last of Japan's effective carrier aviation. They understood it when Saipan fell and the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands became possible. They understood that the American drive toward the Philippines would ultimately succeed, regardless of what the fleet did. What they planned, therefore, was not victory. It was a sacrifice. The Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf was a trap, but not the kind that wins battles. It was the kind that saves face. The plan involved 3 separate forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions with the specific intention of destroying the American amphibious transports carrying MacArthur's invasion troops. But embedded in the plan was a deliberate sacrifice. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Northern Force. He had carriers, mostly empty carriers, because Japan had almost no trained carrier pilots left after the Philippine Sea. But from the air, from radar, they looked like carriers. They were bait. Plan required Ozawa to position his forces where Halsey would find them, where Halsey would do exactly what his personality and his combat record suggested he would do: chase them. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, Admiral Halsey received word that American search aircraft had located a Japanese carrier force to the north. It was the largest carrier force the Japanese had put to sea in months. Multiple fleet carriers, cruisers, destroyers, almost no aircraft. Halsey ordered 3rd Fleet north, every ship, Iowa, New Jersey, all 6 of the fast battleships that composed Task Force 34, all the carriers, all the cruisers and destroyers. The entire striking force of the American Pacific Fleet turned north to pursue Ozawa's decoys. San Bernardino Strait, the water passage through which Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had already begun to move, was left unguarded. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded 7th Fleet, the force responsible for protecting MacArthur's landing ships in Leyte Gulf. He had his own battleships, old ones, the survivors of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt and returned to service. He had received a message from Halsey that implied, but did not explicitly state, that Task Force 34 would guard San Bernardino Strait while 3rd Fleet moved north. Halsey had not made this arrangement. Halsey had taken everything with him. At 647, on the morning of October 25th, lookouts aboard USS White Plains, one of the small escort carriers of Task Force 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, spotted pagoda masts on the horizon to the north, then gun flashes, then shells landing in the water around them. Kurita's center force, which the American command believed to have been stopped and turned back the previous day, had come through San Bernardino Strait overnight and emerged on the other side directly behind Taffy 3. The force that appeared on the horizon included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against this, 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were designed to support amphibious landings and anti-submarine patrol. They were not combat vessels in any serious sense. Their planes carried bombs designed for land targets, not armor-piercing rounds for battleships. Their speed was 18 knots. Kurita's cruisers could make 35. There was no way this should have ended in anything other than a massacre. Admiral Kinkaid began sending messages to Halsey. The first at 707, enemy BBs and cruisers reported firing on Taffy 3 from 658. Halsey was 300 miles to the north, in pursuit of Ozawa's empty carriers aboard USS New Jersey when the first message arrived. The second message came, the third, the fourth. In the history of naval communication, there are few sequences as desperate as the messages Kinkaid sent from 7th Fleet that morning. He needed help. He needed the battleships. He needed Task Force 34 that he had been led to believe was waiting at San Bernardino. Halsey did not turn back. Not immediately. Not until 1000, when a message arrived from Admiral Nimitz himself, written in a tone that left no ambiguity about its meaning, that finally caused Halsey to reverse course. By then, the battle had already reached its extraordinary conclusion through means that no naval planner had anticipated. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 charged Kurita's battleships. 6 small ships against the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled in years. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston, having received no order and needing none, turned his ship toward Yamato and fired his torpedoes. The other destroyers followed. Smoke screens, constant course changes, shells that could not penetrate Japanese armor, but whose muzzle flashes confused Japanese gun crews about the size of the force they were fighting. Kurita, already shaken from losing 2 heavy cruisers to submarine attack 2 days earlier, uncertain about the composition of the American forces opposing him, increasingly uncertain about the strategic situation, eventually turned north and withdrew. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and 600 men. By any standard of historical naval combat, these ships and these men held off a force that should have destroyed them completely. USS New Jersey and USS Iowa were racing south from 300 miles away. they arrived to find nothing to fight. This was the closest moment. The moment when the main batteries of Iowa and New Jersey could have found purpose. The moment when the guns designed to fight Japanese surface forces could have been used against Japanese surface forces. Halsey got it wrong. Not because he was foolish, but because he was exactly who he had always been, and Ozawa had counted on exactly that. What followed was 50 years of a ship used for things other than what it was built for. Korea arrived in June 1950, with the North Korean Army crossing the 38th parallel. The Navy retrieved the mothballed battleships from reserve. USS Missouri went first, then New Jersey joined later. Shore bombardment missions along the Korean coastline. The 16-inch guns firing at land targets, at supply lines, and troop concentrations and defensive positions in the hills. This was useful work, undeniably effective work, but it was not what the ship had been built for. The armistice came in 1953. The battleships were back into reserve. A pattern had established itself. The Navy would attempt to decommission the Iowa-class permanently. The Marine Corps would object, citing the irreplaceable value of naval gunfire support for amphibious operations. The Army would occasionally join the objection. No other platform could deliver the weight of fire that a 16-inch shell represented. A 16-inch round weighed 2,700 pounds. It could penetrate 21 inches of face-hardened armor. It could destroy a hardened bunker buried 40 feet underground. No aircraft-delivered weapon matched it for penetration of hardened targets. No missile of the era could replicate it cost-effectively. The battleships were useful. They kept not being decommissioned. Vietnam was a different kind of war. In USS New Jersey's deployment, there was a different kind of service. She arrived in the waters off Vietnam in September 1968, deploying with a crew that was fully aware they were sailing a warship designed in one era into a conflict that belonged to another. The enemy had no surface fleet. There was no surface battle to be fought. But the jungle along the Vietnamese coastline contained supply routes and troop concentrations and artillery positions. And a 16-inch shell that could penetrate a Korean side could certainly penetrate a Vietnamese jungle. New Jersey fired 5,688 16-inch rounds and nearly 15,000 5-inch rounds in the course of her Vietnam deployment. She fired at range to targets she couldn't see, guided by spotters. The rounds arrived with a force that shook the ground for a mile in every direction. Veterans who served with ground units near areas where New Jersey had fired described the aftermath in terms that left no doubt about effectiveness. She was decommissioned again in December 1969. A single year of deployment had cost $47 million. The cost was deemed unsustainable, and yet the question of what to do about naval gunfire support for amphibious operations remained unanswered. No one had found a satisfactory replacement. The Marine Corps went on record, repeatedly and consistently, arguing that decommissioning the Iowa class permanently created a capability gap that modern naval technology had not filled. Missiles were expensive and vulnerable to countermeasures. Naval aircraft could be shot down. The 16-inch gun, with a shell that cost roughly $1,000 and arrived with the force of a small earthquake, was a uniquely cost-effective way to destroy hardened targets from standoff range. In 1982, Ronald Reagan's naval buildup included reactivating the Iowa-class battleships as part of a 600-ship Navy concept. Iowa and New Jersey were both recommissioned within months of each other. Missouri and Wisconsin followed. Cold War had given the battleships a new lease on life. Lebanon gave them a problem. In October 1983, a truck bomb destroyed the Marine barracks at Beirut International Airport, killing 241 American service members in the single deadliest terrorist attack against Americans until September 11, 2001. Political pressure for a response was enormous. USS New Jersey was already in the Eastern Mediterranean. She was ordered to provide fire support. The targets were Syrian and militia gun positions in the hills above Beirut, positions that had been firing on American and French forces in the city. From the perspective of pure military effectiveness, the 16-inch guns reached those positions easily. The shells were devastating. Nothing in the Lebanese hills was built to withstand what a battleship could deliver. But Lebanon in 1983 was not a conventional military target. It was a city, a country, a tangled conflict involving multiple factions, foreign governments, and civilians who lived in the hills where the gun positions were located. 16-inch shell that lands near a military target in an urban environment doesn't stay near the military target. The radius of destruction is not precise. The political aftermath of civilian deaths in Beirut was not a minor consideration. Syria and Iran used the bombardment in their propaganda. The shelling of Lebanese positions by an American battleship, with the civilian casualties that attended it, became a recruiting tool. It became an argument. The United States withdrew its forces from Lebanon in February 1984. New Jersey's guns had fired, but what those guns had accomplished, measured against what they had cost in political terms, was a question the Navy never fully answered to anyone's satisfaction. Part 3 on April 19th, 1989, USS Iowa was at sea conducting training exercises approximately 300 miles northeast of Puerto Rico. At 9:55, Turret 2 exploded. The turret was in the process of a routine powder charge ramming operation. The 500-pound bags of propellant powder that launched the 16-inch shells had been loaded. The breech was closed. The gun was preparing to fire. Somewhere in the sequence of actions that gun crews had performed tens of thousands of times without incident, something went wrong. The force of the explosion killed all 47 men in the turret instantly. It blew the armored doors off the chamber. It sent fire through the powder train that connected the turret to the magazine below. And it was only because of the heroic action of surviving crew members who flooded the magazine that the ship itself did not detonate. 47 men dead in a training drill on a ship that had been fired upon by an enemy in an actual battle exactly 0 times. The investigation that followed was, by any fair assessment, a disaster. The Navy's Criminal Investigative Service, under institutional pressure to find a cause, focused early on a single sailor. Gunner's mate Clayton Hartwig, 24 years old, from Painesville, Ohio, had died in the explosion. He could not speak in his own defense. His personal life was examined in detail that bordered on invasion. His relationships studied, his letters read, his psychology analyzed by experts who had never met him. The Navy concluded that Hartwig had deliberately caused the explosion, that it was an act of intentional sabotage, possibly combined with a desire to die. His family refused to accept this. His sister, Kathleen Kubicina, became the most visible face of a 3-year campaign to clear her brother's name. She testified before Congress. She challenged the Navy's investigators publicly. She did not stop. The General Accounting Office conducted its own investigation. It examined the physical evidence that the Navy's investigation had considered and drew different conclusions. The most probable cause, the GIO determined, was an overrun of the powder bags during the ramming process, which had created friction and heat sufficient to cause ignition. It was a mechanical failure or a procedural one. It was not sabotage. The Navy revised its conclusions. It acknowledged that it could not determine the cause of the explosion with certainty. It extended an apology to the Hartwig family. The apology could not give Kathleen Kubicina her brother back. USS Iowa was decommissioned in October 1990. She never returned to active service. USS New Jersey followed in February 1991. USS Missouri in March 1992. USS Wisconsin in September 1992. When Wisconsin was decommissioned, It ended something that had existed without interruption since the founding of the Republic. 200 years. The United States Navy had maintained ships of the line, ships built around the heaviest guns available, ships whose entire purpose was to engage enemy surface forces in direct combat. The last of those ships was now gone. No other nation maintained operational battleships. The era was over. The Marine Corps objected formally and loudly for years. Corps commandants testified before congressional committees that no existing technology replicated what a 16-inch gun could do. Missiles were expensive per round, vulnerable to countermeasures, and their effects were less certain against hardened targets. Naval aircraft required pilots, were vulnerable to anti-aircraft systems, and couldn't deliver the same mass of explosive in a single pass. The 16-inch gun, with its cheap ammunition, its penetrating power, and its ability to fire continuously for extended periods, filled a role in amphibious warfare support that nothing else could replicate at comparable cost. The Navy's answer always was that the ships were too expensive to man and maintain, that the manpower required to crew a battleship could be better used elsewhere, that the Cold War's end had changed strategic requirements. In 2006, Congress removed Iowa and Wisconsin from the Naval Vessel Register, which had kept them in reserve as potential recall candidates. It was the formal ending. The ships would become museums. Iowa went to San Pedro, California. New Jersey went to Camden, New Jersey, moored across the Delaware River from the city of Philadelphia, visible from the same shore where Walt Whitman had lived and written. Missouri is anchored at Pearl Harbor, at the exact spot where the Japanese attack began the war, whose outcome she helped secure without ever fighting a battleship. Wisconsin is in Norfolk, Virginia. Visitors walk their decks today. They stand in the shadow of the 16-inch gun barrels that extend over their heads. Many of them are men who served in uniform, who understand in their bones what those guns represented. They look down into the barrels that go on longer than a bowling lane. They touch the shells on display in the magazines below, the shells that weigh more than they do. They ask the question. Everyone who knows this story asks the question eventually, because it is the question that the history leaves permanently open. What would have happened if Iowa had met Yamato? Specifications favor Iowa. On speed and armor protection design, favor Yamato on gun caliber and broadside weight. The fire control systems are different, the training different, the tactical situations hypothetical. Every analysis that has been done by naval historians and strategists arrives at the same honest answer, which is that nobody knows. Nobody knows because it never happened. Yamato was sunk on April 7th, 1945, by a sustained American air attack southwest of Kyushu. 286 aircraft, 10 torpedo hits, 5 bomb hits. She capsized and sank in approximately 2 hours, taking most of her crew of 2,700 men with her. She was destroyed by the same force that had made the Iowa-class's main purpose obsolete, the same carrier aviation that had changed naval warfare at Midway before New Jersey was even commissioned. The ship that the Iowa-class was built to fight was sunk by planes. 19 battle stars on a ship that never fought another ship. That number is not nothing. The battle stars represent shore bombardments that supported infantry advances, anti-aircraft fire that may have protected carrier aircraft, escort duties that allowed the carriers to operate without constant fear of surface attack. The ship did its work. Its crew did their work. People who served aboard those ships and their descendants have reason to be proud of what was accomplished. But there is something that sits alongside the pride, something that the history won't resolve no matter how many times the record is examined. Finest surface combatant ever built by the United States Navy was built to face an adversary that the carrier aircraft had already made into a secondary concern before the ship entered the theater of war. The ship was designed for a decisive engagement that never came. It was kept in service for half a century, doing work that it was never intended to do. called back again and again because no one had found anything that could replace what it could do, fired in anger in Vietnam and Lebanon in ways that complicated the political situations they were meant to resolve, and ultimately retired not because it had failed, but because the world had changed around it in ways that its designers could not have anticipated. The gun that was built to kill Yamato never fired at Yamato, never fired at anything that moved on the surface of the ocean. The gun that was built to decide the naval war sat in its turret for 50 years, maintained and ready and waiting, and the moment it was designed for never arrived. The answer to the question of what Iowa would have done against Yamato is that we will never know. The answer to the question of why is that history decided not to provide the circumstances, that the carrier pilots got there first, that the moment when battleship met battleship, the kind of moment that capital ships had been built toward for 2 centuries, had passed before the last and finest of those ships had fully arrived. Walk the deck of New Jersey in Camden on a clear day. Look out across the Delaware toward Pennsylvania. Listen to the guide explain what each gun barrel weighs, how long the shells are, how far they could reach. Then stand still for a moment. The river moves quietly. The city makes its sounds. The gun barrels point outward toward an ocean that is calm today, as it often is, as it will be long after the last person alive who remembers why those guns were built has gone. They were the most powerful surface weapons an American ship ever carried. They never found the fight they were made for.